Sirens tore through the night as a section of Vought Tower sheared inward, glass and steel cascading down into the river while floodlights skittered across a dozen terrified faces. 2 blocks away, a CIA black site watched the collapse on a loop, agents exchanging tight, quick sentences while fingers hovered over encrypted lines. Among the smoke and the sirens, a man moved like a rumor, not running, not hiding, simply shifting across the edges of light and becoming less, until the cameras saw nothing but a dark smear where a person should be. By the time anyone registered that a shadow had passed through locked doors and reached the vault beneath corporate command, a Supe had landed on the roof, turning toward the street like a god dissatisfied. The first shot of this night had been fired and answered, and the consequence of that exchange would draw lines between nations, corporations, and monsters in ways no planning cell had counted for. This is only the beginning, and worse is coming. If you want to stay for the fallout, subscribe now and listen closely. This is a warning, not a promise. Hit subscribe once and remember what you heard here, because what's about to unfold will ripple far beyond tonight and you won't want to miss the consequences. The CIA did not announce the problem publicly, because doing so would have required admitting that they had lost control of it months ago, somewhere between classified budget reallocations and an untraceable shipment of Compound V that never reached its intended vault. In a sealed operations room buried beneath Langley, a projected reconstruction of Vaught's internal structure rotated slowly in the air, while analysts attempted to map behavioral patterns instead of physical ones. Because Supes didn't operate like assets or enemies in any category the agency had defined. Their conclusion, delivered without ceremony, was that Vought had developed something beyond its usual controlled instability, and every attempt to observe it internally had either disappeared or defected within 48 hours of exposure. This was no longer a question of oversight or espionage, but of containment, and containment was not something the CIA could achieve without triggering the very catastrophe they were trying to avoid. Sung Jin-Woo listened to the briefing without interrupting, his gaze moving between the speakers with the detached attention of someone cataloging threats rather than absorbing persuasion. The agency had approached him not as an ally, but as a solution they couldn't model, a variable that existed outside the Supe economy, and therefore outside Vaught's predictive frameworks. He did not respond to their requests with agreement or disagreement, only asked for 2 things: access to their failed surveillance data, and assurance that his presence would not be acknowledged under any circumstance if it was detected. They accepted too quickly, which confirmed what he had already assumed about their desperation, and when they began discussing contingency plans involving monitoring his movements, he simply nodded, as though humoring a theoretical exercise. Jin-Woo had no intention of becoming an asset in someone else's structure, especially when that structure had invited him in because it was collapsing. The insertion point was selected based on a 3-minute blind interval between Vaught's internal drone rotations, a gap that technically shouldn't have existed, but had persisted across 6 consecutive nights for reasons their own engineers could not explain. Jin-Woo arrived without aircraft or escort, emerging from the base of a service corridor shadow that did not belong to the architecture moments after a maintenance worker passed through it. His presence displaced nothing, tripped no alarm, and registered only as a brief temperature fluctuation on a sensor calibrated to detect equipment malfunctions. Above him, Vaught's lower executive floors pulsed with late-night activity as public relations teams prepared statements for crises that had not yet occurred but inevitably would. Inside the operations center, the CIA's live feed struggled to maintain visual lock as Jin-Woo moved beyond the threshold of recorded light, their infrared attempting to reconcile the absence of motion with the confirmed presence of mass. A junior analyst muttered something about electromagnetic interference, while a supervisor began quietly authorizing secondary satellites to reorient toward Manhattan in case escalation required plausible deniability through orbital observation. They did not understand what they were watching, and therefore attempted to categorize it as a failure in their own systems, which was preferable to admitting that an external actor had entered Vaught's infrastructure without resistance. For now, they could still pretend this was an investigation. 3 floors above, a Supe assigned to internal deterrence turned his head before any alarm sounded, his posture shifting with the lazy irritation of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Black Noir's mask revealed nothing, but his attention settled toward a corridor that should have been empty, his stance tightening as the air pressure dipped by an imperceptible degree. Jin-Woo did not stop moving, though his trajectory adjusted by a fraction that placed him beyond direct line of sight, allowing him to observe the Supes' reaction rather than provoke it prematurely. Supes were not monsters in the dungeon sense, and therefore not bound to the same instincts, which meant their threat potential would need to be measured empirically rather than assumed. The first clash occurred not because Jin-Woo initiated contact, but because Black Noir decided the absence of explanation was itself a hostile act, launching forward with the kind of explosive force that shattered tile underfoot. Surveillance cameras captured the initial impact as a blur, Noir's blade intersecting with something that refused to exist long enough to be cut, his follow-through carrying him into a wall that cratered inward from the missed strike. Jin-Woo reappeared behind him, not attacking immediately but assessing the Supe's recovery speed and reaction time as Noir twisted with mechanical precision. When the counterstrike came, it passed through Jin-Woo's fatting outline and struck a support column instead, shearing it halfway through before the structure stabilized. From Langley, someone whispered that the feed had glitched, though the audio of fractured concrete suggested otherwise, and a directive was issued to prepare evacuation narratives in case footage leaked. Jin-Woo's response was measured, his hand extending just enough for the darkness at his feet to stir in recognition, though he did not summon fully, conserving presence rather than overwhelming it. Black Noir advanced again, adapting to the evasions by flooding the corridor with motion and forcing Jin-Woo into the open where stealth would cost him structural integrity. It was a calculated move, and one that would have worked on a conventional infiltrator. Instead, Jin-Woo allowed the strike to connect, absorbing the kinetic force across a partially materialized shadow that dispersed the impact through the floor beneath them. The building tremored, alarms finally engaging as automated systems interpreted the shockwave as a seismic event, and security teams began converging from adjacent sectors. Noir hesitated for less than a second, recalibrating to an opponent who had not broken under force, and in that hesitation, Jin-Woo moved within range. He did not kill him. The decision was immediate and pragmatic, driven by the understanding that extraction required death under conditions he did not yet control, and Supes were not guaranteed to yield the same compliance as dungeon entities. Instead, he struck with enough force to disrupt Noir's balance and drive him through the reinforced glass of an interior office, the impact cascading into the floor below. As the Supe fell, Jin-Woo stepped into the shadow cast by the collapsing debris and vanished from every camera in the sector. Above them, Homelander had already begun to turn toward the disturbance, his expression shifting from idle curiosity to something sharper as Vaught's internal comms flooded with reports they could not contextualize. The building's lockdown protocols initiated in overlapping sequences, sealing exits and rerouting power toward containment fields designed for threats that had never required invisibility to function. And somewhere within that lockdown, Jin-Woo was already moving toward the vault. Vought Tower did not go into full lockdown because of the structural damage alone, but because the internal behavioral monitors began flagging something they had never encountered before, a pattern of absence where presence should have been. Doors opened without authorization, but without force. Cameras tracked movement that resolved into nothing, and biometric scanners briefly detected a human heartbeat that could not be located by any thermal signature. Within 90 seconds of Black Noir's fall through the executive floor, An automated threat index escalated from espionage to internal hostile incursion, triggering the deployment of on-site Supes who were not meant to leave the building under any circumstances. The corporate logic was simple, even if the threat was not. If something had entered their core without being announced, it needed to be stopped before it became something the public could see. From the CIA's observation room, the situation shifted from controlled insertion to rapidly deteriorating uncertainty, as Vaught's comms traffic spiked beyond any internal drill parameters they had mapped. An analyst suggested aborting, pointing out that prolonged exposure increased the likelihood of Supes identifying patterns in Jin-Woo's movement, which could then be monetized or weaponized by Vaught's predictive teams. The supervisor overseeing the mission rejected the idea without raising his voice, not because he believed they were still in control, but because the alternative involved explaining why they had invited an unknown actor into the most sensitive corporate infrastructure on the planet, and then allowed him to disappear mid-operation. Jin-Woo had insisted that once inside, he would determine his own extraction window, and they had agreed because they did not have the leverage to demand otherwise. 2 levels beneath the executive suites, Jin-Woo reached the perimeter of the restricted vault sector and paused not from uncertainty, but from calculation, his senses mapping the density of personnel and the irregularities in airflow that indicated concealed reinforcement teams. The shadows along the corridor lengthened as emergency lighting engaged, and with them came the faint pressure of something beginning to notice his presence in a way that surveillance systems could not articulate. Supes were not reacting to alarms anymore, but to instinct, their attention drifting toward a threat that did not conform to sound or scent, but existed somewhere deeper in the cognitive hierarchy that Compound V had altered. The first to intercept him was A-Train, arriving with a sonic crack that split the hallway's silence as he attempted to tackle what he assumed was an intruder pinned by lockdown geometry. His momentum carried him through Jin-Woo's previous position and into a reinforced bulkhead, the impact leaving a dent that rippled outward like a shockwave across still water. He recovered almost instantly, circling with the impatience of someone used to ending conflicts before they began, his gaze narrowing as he realized his opponent had not been thrown by the collision. Jin-Woo stepped into view deliberately this time, allowing the Supe a full second to register that there was, in fact, someone standing there. A-Train did not hesitate, accelerating again with enough force to fracture the floor, but Jin-Woo's response was not to evade entirely, but to shift just enough that the speedster's trajectory passed within arm's reach. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat, Jin-Woo's hand closing around empty air where A-Train had been, and then around fabric as the Supe attempted to decelerate for another pass. The resulting throw was not dramatic but precise, redirecting momentum into a support pillar that snapped with a sound like distant thunder, sending dust and debris cascading into the hall. Security teams arriving from adjacent sectors opened fire, their rounds intersecting with shadows that absorbed or redirected the impacts without visible effect, forcing them to fall back behind automated cover systems. Jin-Woo did not summon fully, but the darkness at his feet began to take form in brief, half-realized extensions that intercepted incoming threats, and then dissolved before the cameras could focus on them. Each manifestation carried a cost, a subtle increase in the oppressive weight that now pressed against the corridor like an approaching storm front, and the CIA's instruments registered the change as a spike in ambient energy they could not classify. Above them, Homelander hovered just beneath the ceiling of the upper atrium, listening to the reports with growing irritation as they failed to provide him with something he could confront directly. The idea of an infiltrator that could bypass Noir and withstand A-Train's speed without triggering a visible defense was not just offensive but destabilizing, implying the existence of a weapon that did not belong to Vaught's supply chain. He descended without authorization, ignoring the protests of handlers who understood that his involvement would escalate the situation beyond recovery. Back in the vault sector, Jin-Woo reached the final security threshold just as the air shifted with the unmistakable displacement of someone arriving at speed without touching the ground. Homelander did not announce himself with words, but with presence, his eyes scanning the corridor until they settled on a figure that did not behave like a Supe or a soldier. For a moment neither moved, the building's alarms filling the silence between them, while containment fields hummed to life along the walls. Homelander's first assumption was that he was looking at a state-sponsored weapon, something the CIA had engineered as a contingency against Vaught's autonomy, and the realization did not amuse him. His curiosity sharpened into territorial aggression as he stepped forward, the floor beneath him creaking under the casual application of force. Jin-Woo did not retreat, though the shadows behind him deepened in response to the proximity of a threat that registered as something fundamentally different from anything he had encountered in a dungeon. The confrontation was already in motion. Vought did not interpret the encounter between Homelander and an unidentified infiltrator as a security failure, but as an attack with implications that extended far beyond the building itself, which meant the response could not be limited to internal containment. Within 3 minutes of Homelander's unauthorized descent toward the vault sector, the Executive Crisis Board had assembled in a hardened conference suite, where legal advisors sat beside military liaisons and public relations strategists in the same tight formation. Their immediate concern was not the breach itself, but the narrative vacuum it would create if footage escaped without a prepared explanation, especially given that Black Noir and A-Train had both failed to neutralize the threat in controlled environments. This was no longer a matter of keeping an intruder out, but of preventing the idea of that intruder from existing in the public imagination. From Langley, the CIA's operational posture shifted again, as Vaught's internal network began encrypting entire sectors without warning, severing access to feeds they had spent months quietly cultivating. Analysts scrambled to reroute through dormant satellites, while contingency teams drafted statements denying any involvement in private corporate security incidents, even as they watched Jin-Woo's biometric ghost move toward a confrontation they could not influence. The agency had expected resistance from Supes, but not the speed at which Vaught's internal logic would pivot from defense to narrative warfare, sealing off not just corridors but data pathways in an attempt to isolate the threat from any external observer. Jin-Woo had warned them that corporations reacted differently to infiltration than governments did, prioritizing perception over immediate survival, and now they were watching that principle unfold in real time. Inside the vault corridor, Homelander's presence altered the atmosphere in a way that the building's systems could not compensate for, his proximity turning automated responses sluggish as if the architecture itself were deferring to him. He approached Jin-Woo without haste, the faint hum of containment fields reflecting off his uniform as his gaze attempted to categorize what stood before him. There was no recognition in his expression, only irritation that something had entered his territory without invitation or fear, and when he spoke, it was not a demand for identification but an accusation delivered with casual certainty. To him, this was not an intruder but a deployment. Jin-Woo did not answer, his attention fixed instead on the way Homelander's stance suggested both confidence and an underlying expectation of obedience, as though confrontation were merely a formality before submission. The shadows behind him tightened in response, stretching along the corridor's edges as emergency lighting flickered under the strain of competing power draws. Supes were not governed by dungeon logic, which meant that extraction remained uncertain even if elimination were achieved, and Jin-Woo had no intention of expending resources on a kill that yielded no long-term advantage. His objective remained the vault, not the Supe standing between him and it. Homelander interpreted the silence as confirmation of hostile intent, his irritation tipping into aggression as heat gathered behind his eyes, casting thin red reflections across the reinforced walls. The first strike was not a beam, but a step forward that fractured the floor, forcing Jin-Woo to adjust his footing as the corridor's integrity failed beneath the pressure. When the heat vision followed, it did so in a controlled sweep designed to herd rather than destroy, cutting off retreat vectors and forcing Jin-Woo into a narrower field of engagement. The impact against the shadowed barrier that rose to meet it was not visible in the conventional sense, but the result manifested as a ripple through the building's structural frame, setting off alarms in sectors that had not yet registered the breach. Jin-Woo's counter was immediate but measured, his movement carrying him beyond the beam's path and into Homelander's peripheral awareness without committing to a full strike. The exchange lasted seconds, yet in that time the containment fields along the corridor began to overload, their output spiking as if responding to a pressure differential they could not equalize. Above them, Vought's crisis board authorized the deployment of additional Supes under the classification of internal deterrence, though none of the individuals involved had been briefed on what they would be facing. Their assumption was that Homelander's presence would resolve the incursion before they arrived, allowing the corporation to spin the event as a routine test of security protocols. What they did not account for was the way his aggression would escalate the encounter beyond a manageable threshold. Back in Langley, a senior analyst finally voiced what the others had been thinking, that if Homelander engaged fully, the resulting energy release could compromise the tower's lower infrastructure and expose whatever Jin-Woo had come to investigate. The supervisor did not respond, because the mission parameters had already shifted beyond anything they could recall, and aborting now would require revealing their involvement to a corporation that did not tolerate unsanctioned oversight. In the corridor, Homelander advanced again, this time with the unmistakable intent to end the confrontation through force alone, while Jin-Woo stepped backward into a shadow that should not have existed under direct illumination. The vault door behind him began to cycle through emergency locks, reacting to pressure that had nothing to do with temperature or motion. And somewhere within that cycling mechanism, something else woke up. The first indication that the situation had moved beyond Vought Tower did not come from the damage reports or the loss of internal surveillance, but from the sudden spike in emergency calls across Lower Manhattan, as civilians began reporting structural tremors with no identifiable source. Subway tunnels registered pressure shifts that engineers initially attributed to routine maintenance failures, while traffic cameras caught brief distortions in street-level shadows that vanished before automated systems could flag them. Within 7 minutes of Homelander's engagement in the vault corridor, the building's containment grid had rerouted enough power to destabilize adjacent infrastructure, creating a cascading effect that extended into the surrounding blocks. What had begun as an internal lockdown was now expressing itself as a citywide anomaly. Inside the tower, Jin-Woo felt the change before he saw it, the subtle pull of shadow density increasing as the vault's emergency protocols engaged with mechanisms designed to repel energy-based assaults rather than infiltrators who moved through darkness. The cycling door behind him slowed, its layered locks attempting to interpret the presence of something that did not emit heat or electromagnetic signatures, but nonetheless exerted pressure on their thresholds. Homelander's next strike intersected with a partially manifested barrier, the resulting impact sending a vibration through the building that translated into a rolling tremor along the street outside. Glass fractured across multiple floors, raining down into intersections where pedestrians had not yet understood why the air felt heavier. From Langley, the CIA's satellite feeds began returning images that no longer matched their predictive models, showing localized blackouts spreading outward from Vought Tower in irregular patterns. Analysts attempted to overlay seismic data with power grid fluctuations, searching for correlations that would justify intervention without revealing their involvement. The agency had planned for an internal confrontation, not for the possibility that Jin-Woo's engagement with a Supe could alter the environmental baseline of an entire district. Evacuation advisories were drafted under the guise of utility failures, though no one believed they would remain contained if the tower's integrity continued to degrade. On the upper levels, Queen Maeve intercepted a security team attempting to descend toward the vault sector, her expression tightening as she listened to overlapping reports of an intruder who had survived contact with both Noir and A-Train. She did not ask for authorization before moving, because the idea of Homelander engaging an unknown threat without oversight carried implications she did not trust Vought to manage responsibly. As she entered the compromised corridor, the emergency lighting flickered again, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Jin-Woo noted her arrival without shifting his stance, cataloging the change in threat distribution as another variable in an already unstable equation. Supes did not operate as coordinated units in the same way hunters might, but their individual power sets could create interference patterns that complicated stealth-based movement. The shadows at his feet deepened in response, forming brief extensions that tested the boundaries of the containment fields, now struggling to maintain coherence under Homelander's proximity. Outside, the tremors intensified as power relays across Midtown began tripping in sequence, their fail-safes activating too slowly to prevent localized outages. Emergency services flooded the streets, attempting to establish perimeters around buildings that had not yet shown visible damage, but continued to resonate with low-frequency vibrations. News helicopters circled at a distance, their cameras searching for an explanation that would not expose the truth of what was happening beneath Vought's reinforced floors. Back in the corridor, Maeve slowed as she approached the intersection where Homelander hovered above fractured tile, his attention fixed on Jin-Woo with an intensity that bordered on fascination. She did not understand what she was looking at, only that the man standing between them did not behave like any Supes she had encountered, his presence drawing the light inward rather than reflecting it. When she spoke, it was not to the intruder but to Homelander, asking why the building felt like it was being compressed from the inside. He did not answer. The vault door behind Jin-Woo finally disengaged one of its deeper locks with a sound that carried through the corridor like a distant detonation, triggering another wave of structural stress that rippled outward into the city's foundation. Somewhere above, a transformer exploded, plunging 3 blocks into darkness as emergency generators struggled to compensate. And the shadows continued to grow. The moment Vaught's internal systems detected that the vault's secondary lock had disengaged without authorization, the situation crossed a threshold that neither corporate crisis management nor intelligence oversight had prepared for, because whatever lay behind that final barrier was not insured against infiltration. Within 90 seconds, an encrypted priority signal left the tower and reached a joint defense liaison tasked with coordinating Supe deployment during national emergencies, its language deliberately vague, but its urgency unmistakable. This was no longer categorized as a breach, but as a potential strategic compromise, which meant that federal response assets could be mobilized without public disclosure under the justification of infrastructure protection. From the CIA's operations room, the shift was immediate and unwelcome as Department of Defense channels began lighting up with requests for clarification that Langley was not authorized to provide. Surveillance drones stationed along the Hudson received silent tasking updates, their patrol routes adjusting toward Manhattan under the guise of routine readiness drills. The agency had invited Jin-Woo to investigate Vought precisely because they wanted to avoid military involvement, understanding that visible escalation would force the corporation into a defensive posture that could not be reversed without political fallout. Now, as fighter aircraft were placed on standby at nearby bases, that calculation was unraveling in real time. Inside the vault corridor, the containment fields finally failed, their overlapping hum collapsing into silence as Homelander's proximity overwhelmed their output. The resulting pressure change was subtle but immediate, the shadows along the walls thickening in response as though relieved of an artificial constraint. Jin-Woo stepped backward into that density, his attention fixed on the partially opened vault door rather than the two Supes now occupying the intersection. Maeve's stance shifted as she felt the same change, her instincts warning that whatever had been holding the corridor together had just given way. Homelander interpreted the failure differently, his expression tightening as he realized that the building systems were no longer capable of containing the engagement. His irritation hardened into something more deliberate, the casual aggression of moments earlier replaced by an intent that carried implications beyond simple territorial defense. If this was a state weapon, then allowing it to access Vaught's core without resistance would signal weakness he could not afford to display. Outside, the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, their approach masked by the city's ambient noise, until they reached the outer perimeter established by local law enforcement. Emergency broadcasts began advising residents to remain indoors as power outages spread along the avenues, their cause attributed to a cascading grid failure that technicians were actively addressing. No mention was made of the tremors that continued to ripple outward from Vought Tower, nor of the shadows that now seemed to pool unnaturally beneath streetlights. Back in Langley, a senior operations chief authorized the deployment of a rapid response team under the classification of infrastructure security, their official mandate to assist in evacuation if structural compromise became imminent. Unofficially, they were to observe and report on any manifestation of abilities that did not align with known Supe profiles. The agency still did not understand Jin-Woo's power set, but the environmental effects now registering across Manhattan suggested that prolonged engagement could produce consequences they would be unable to contain. In the corridor, Maeve took a step forward, positioning herself at an angle that allowed her to monitor both Homelander and the intruder without committing to either side. Jin-Woo's presence continued to exert a pressure that was not physical, yet influenced the way light and sound behaved in his vicinity, a distortion that made distance difficult to judge. When the vault door disengaged another lock, the sound triggered a fresh wave of structural stress that translated into a shudder along the street outside, setting off car alarms in a widening radius. Above them, the helicopters reached holding pattern, their pilots awaiting authorization that had not yet been granted. Within the tower, Vaught's executive board authorized the deployment of additional Supes to the lower levels, despite legal advisors warning that such concentration of power in a compromised structure could accelerate failure. And the vault continued to open. The moment military aviation entered a holding pattern above Manhattan without public acknowledgement, foreign intelligence networks began asking questions that the United States could not answer without revealing more than it intended. Satellite observation platforms in low orbit registered the same power irregularities that had tripped New York's local grid, their sensors detecting localized gravitational inconsistencies near Vought Tower that did not align with any known atmospheric or seismic event. Within 12 minutes of the first helicopter's arrival, encrypted inquiries were transmitted through diplomatic backchannels, requesting clarification on whether an experimental weapons platform had been activated within a civilian population center. Washington did not respond, because any admission would validate concerns they were not prepared to manage. Back in Langley, the CIA's operational leadership found themselves in the unfamiliar position of attempting to slow escalation initiated by their own allies, as Department of Defense officials pressed for authorization to insert a containment unit under the justification of protecting corporate intellectual property with national security implications. The agency had wanted an investigation that could be denied, a quiet intrusion that would either confirm or dismiss suspicions about Vaught's internal developments. Instead, Jin-Woo's confrontation with Homelander had created an environmental signature that foreign observers were now interpreting as a strategic deployment, one that might justify reciprocal readiness measures if left unexplained. Inside Vought Tower, the vault door finally disengaged its final lock with a resonant impact that traveled through the building's frame and into the surrounding bedrock, registering on seismographs across the eastern seaboard as a minor tectonic event. Jin-Woo stepped into the threshold without hesitation, his attention shifting toward the interior where rows of containment units housed materials that radiated a faint, unnatural density. Compound V was not a living entity, but in aggregate it produced a pressure that the shadows responded to instinctively, stretching toward the sealed canisters as though recognizing a potential catalyst. Homelander followed, his irritation now sharpened into suspicion as he realized that the intruder's objective had never been to engage, but to reach this exact point within the structure. Maeve remained just behind him, her gaze moving between the containment arrays and the man who had bypassed every layer of security designed to prevent access. Whatever Vought had stored here was not intended for public knowledge, which meant its exposure would trigger responses far beyond corporate litigation. Outside, the helicopters received new orders, their holding pattern tightening as rapid response teams prepared to deploy under blackout conditions that would minimize civilian awareness. News outlets began reporting unexplained outages across Midtown, their footage showing emergency vehicles navigating streets that had grown darker with each passing minute. International markets responded to the uncertainty with subtle shifts that traders attributed to routine volatility, though analysts watching intelligence feeds knew the cause was anything but routine. Within the vault, Jin-Woo reached toward one of the containment units and paused, not from hesitation, but from recognition that whatever interaction occurred here would carry consequences beyond the immediate mission parameters. Shadow extraction required death, and there was no guarantee that Supes would yield the same compliance as dungeon entities, yet the material before him suggested a pathway that did not rely on conventional engagement. Behind him, Homelander's gaze hardened as the implications settled into place, his earlier assumption of a state-sponsored weapon evolving into something more personal. If this man intended to tamper with Vaught's core assets, then the confrontation would not end with containment but with eradication. And above the city, additional aircraft were already en route. The vault had never been designed for intrusion by something that did not trigger motion sensors, heat differentials, or electromagnetic disruption, which meant that once Jin-Woo crossed its threshold, the internal response defaulted to protocols meant for catastrophic containment failure rather than espionage. Blast shutters began cycling into place along the outer corridors, while the tower's remaining power reserves rerouted toward environmental stabilization in an attempt to prevent Compound V degradation. What those systems could not account for was the way the material inside the containment units reacted to the presence of something that existed outside the biochemical parameters it had been engineered to enhance. From Langley, the CIA's live feed returned in fragments as Vaught's encryption layers shifted again, allowing brief glimpses of Jin-Woo moving between the containment arrays while Homelander closed the distance behind him. Analysts attempted to correlate the vault's internal layout with the tremor patterns now registering across Manhattan, searching for evidence that structural compromise had reached a critical threshold. The agency's original objective had been to confirm whether Vought was developing an asset that could destabilize geopolitical balance. Now they were watching an external actor interact with that possibility in ways no predictive model could interpret. Inside the vault, Homelander's restraint gave way to action as he lunged forward, his movement compressing the air enough to rattle the sealed canisters along the far wall. Jin-Woo did not evade entirely this time, pivoting just enough to redirect the strike into a reinforced containment frame that buckled under the impact. The resulting rupture released a fine mist of Compound V into the air, triggering automated suppression systems that sprayed neutralizing agents across the chamber. Maeve stepped in as the mist spread, her instinct to prevent exposure overriding corporate protocol, though the suppressant foam already forming along the floor suggested the vault was attempting to isolate the breach. Jin-Woo's shadows reacted immediately, stretching outward to intercept the dispersal pattern before it could reach his position, their partial manifestation drawing a sharp drop in ambient light that the emergency system struggled to counteract. Outside, the rapid response teams deployed from hovering aircraft onto adjacent rooftops, their orders to establish observation points rather than engage, until further authorization was granted. Military command still did not understand what they were preparing to confront, only that the environmental anomalies centered on Vought Tower had begun to affect nearby infrastructure in ways that could not be attributed to equipment failure. Back in the vault, Homelander advanced again, his irritation now tempered by a growing recognition that brute force alone would not resolve the encounter without risking damage to assets he had been conditioned to protect. Jin-Woo's presence continued to exert a pressure that made distance unreliable, the shadows at his feet deepening with each containment unit that ruptured under stray impacts. Maeve moved to flank, her stance suggesting an intent to contain rather than destroy, though the distinction grew less meaningful as the vault's environmental controls struggled to compensate for overlapping stressors. Jin-Woo reached toward another containment frame, his attention fixed on the way the shadows responded to the material within, as though recognizing a potential for conversion that did not require traditional extraction. Above them, the tower's structural integrity index dipped below safe parameters, prompting an automated advisory that went unanswered by executives now focused on managing public fallout. News helicopters maintained distance, their cameras capturing only darkness where light should have reflected from Vaught's upper floors. And the resistance was beginning to fracture. The vault's atmospheric control systems had been calibrated to manage biochemical instability, not the interaction between compound V particulates and something that did not belong to the same physical framework, which meant their response degraded into recursive feedback loops within seconds of the second containment breach. Suppressant foam thickened along the chamber floor, rising in uneven ridges that attempted to isolate the ruptured frames, while ventilation systems cycled air through filters already overwhelmed by particulate density. Jin-Woo remained at the center of that failing equilibrium, his attention fixed on the way the shadows coiled toward the exposed compound, as though responding to a silent directive. From the CIA's observation room, the feed stabilized just long enough to show Homelander engaging again, this time with a level of force that suggested he had abandoned concern for the vault's contents. Analysts noted the shift immediately, recognizing that whatever corporate restraint had been in place was no longer influencing his decision-making process. The agency had assumed that Vaught's interest in preserving proprietary material would temper Supes' aggression within the chamber. Now they were watching that assumption collapse as the confrontation escalated beyond internal priorities. Inside the vault, Maeve intercepted Homelander's next advance, her grip closing around his shoulder with enough force to redirect his trajectory away from a cluster of intact containment units. The impact drove both of them into a reinforced partition that split under the strain, sending another wave of compound V mist into the air despite the suppressant system's efforts. Jin-Woo adjusted his position as the shadows at his feet thickened, partially manifesting in brief extensions that shielded him from the dispersal pattern without fully committing to summoning. Outside, the rapid response teams reported visual distortion along the tower's lower levels, describing areas where light appeared to bend toward the structure rather than reflect from it. Their commanding officer relayed the observation without commentary, though the implication was clear enough to trigger a secondary advisory from military command. Whatever was happening inside Vought Tower had begun to affect the surrounding environment in ways that could not be contained by structural isolation alone. Back in the chamber, Homelander broke free of Maeve's hold and pivoted toward Jin-Woo with an expression that had moved beyond irritation into open hostility, his earlier curiosity replaced by a need to assert dominance over something that refused to acknowledge his authority. The resulting strike intersected with a shadowed barrier that absorbed part of the impact, yet the remaining force translated into a shockwave that rattled the intact containment units along the far wall. Jin-Woo did not retaliate immediately, instead stepping toward a ruptured frame where Compound V continued to leak in slow, viscous threads. The shadows responded in kind, curling around the exposed material in a pattern that suggested recognition rather than resistance. Maeve's attention shifted as she noticed the movement, her stance tightening as she realized the confrontation was no longer limited to physical engagement. Above them, Vaught's executive board authorized the deployment of additional Supes despite the risk of further destabilization, their decision driven by the understanding that losing control of the vault's contents would carry consequences far beyond corporate liability. Military command responded by tightening the aerial perimeter, their pilots instructed to maintain blackout conditions until a clearer assessment could be made. Within the chamber, the suppressant foam reached knee height, its chemical composition reacting unpredictably to the mingling of shadow and compound as containment protocols struggled to interpret the interaction. Homelander advanced again, while Jin-Woo's hand hovered just above the leaking frame. And something irreversible was already beginning. The moment Jin-Woo allowed the shadow at his feet to fully touch the exposed Compound V, the vault's environmental monitors began returning data that did not belong to any classification Vought had ever documented. It was not a chemical reaction, nor an energy discharge, but a shift in density that translated into measurable pressure across the chamber's reinforced walls. Suppressant foam receded from the contact point as though displaced by an unseen force. While the ruptured containment frame groaned under a load it had not been engineered to bear. From Langley, the CIA's instruments registered the change as a localized gravitational anomaly, their readouts spiking beyond acceptable tolerances before stabilizing at levels that suggested sustained interaction. Analysts who had spent their careers modeling Supe engagement found themselves unable to categorize the phenomenon because it did not align with any known application of Compound V or its derivatives. The agency had expected escalation in the form of visible destruction. Instead, they were watching the environment itself begin to reorganize around a single point within Vought Tower. Inside the vault, Homelander reacted before Maeve could intervene, closing the distance with enough force to drive suppressant foam outward in a widening arc. His strike intersected with a shadowed barrier that held for less than a second before dispersing, the remaining impact translating into a shockwave that fractured multiple containment units along the far wall. Compound V spilled into the chamber in glistening sheets, triggering automated isolation protocols that had already begun to fail. Jin-Woo moved through the rupture rather than away from it, his attention fixed on the way the shadows responded to the increased exposure, coiling inward as though drawing substance rather than resisting contamination. The pressure within the vault intensified, manifesting as a low-frequency vibration that set the remaining containment frames humming in sympathetic resonance. Maeve stepped forward again, her stance suggesting an attempt to separate the combatants before further damage could occur, yet the distinction between engagement and environment had already begun to blur. The shadows at Jin-Woo's feet stretched along the foam-slick floor, forming brief, incomplete extensions that dissipated before fully manifesting, each attempt accompanied by a measurable drop in ambient light. Outside, the aerial perimeter tightened as additional aircraft reached holding pattern, their crews reporting instrument drift that could not be attributed to weather or mechanical fault. Military command relayed the anomaly through secured channels, prompting inquiries from foreign observers who had already detected the disturbance via satellite. Back in the vault, Homelander's next advance carried him within arm's reach, his expression hardened by the realization that whatever the intruder was doing could not be undone through force alone. Jin-Woo did not retreat, though the shadows behind him deepened in response to the proximity of a threat that registered beyond conventional metrics. Above them, the tower's structural integrity index dropped again, triggering an automated evacuation advisory that went unanswered. News helicopters circling at a distance captured only darkness where light should have reflected from the vault's upper access points. And the compound continued to react. By the time Vaught's internal systems registered that the vault's containment failure had progressed beyond recovery, the distinction between environmental compromise and operational catastrophe had already dissolved into something that legal teams could not mitigate through language. Compound V was no longer leaking in measurable quantities, but dispersing in a suspended gradient that the vault's atmospheric controls could neither isolate nor neutralize, its interaction with Jin-Woo's shadow field producing a density shift that translated into sustained structural stress across the tower's lower foundation. What had once been a sealed asset now behaved like a catalyst without boundaries, responding not to containment protocols but to proximity. From Langley, the CIA's predictive models began returning failure states that did not account for the tower's collapse, but for the possibility of a broader systemic event, one that might extend beyond Manhattan if the interaction continued unchecked. Analysts attempted to simulate dispersal patterns under varying engagement scenarios, yet each iteration produced the same conclusion. Once exposed at this scale, Compound V could not be reliably recontained without public acknowledgement of its presence. The agency had sought confirmation of a threat. Now they were watching that threat express itself in real time, without allegiance to any institution involved. Inside the vault, Maeve's attempt to separate Homelander from the ruptured containment array ended when the floor beneath them buckled under a sudden pressure differential, dropping both Supes into a lower access trench lined with reinforcement struts that bent under their combined mass. Suppressant foam surged downward to fill the void, its chemical composition reacting unpredictably as it mingled with the suspended compound. Jin-Woo adjusted his footing as the chamber's geometry shifted, the shadows at his feet deepening in response to the increased exposure, while the environmental vibration intensified into a low, continuous tremor. Homelander emerged from the trench with a movement that suggested growing urgency rather than anger, his earlier hostility now tempered by the realization that whatever was happening within the vault could not be reversed through immediate elimination. Outside, the aerial perimeter reported instrument blackout along multiple vectors, prompting military command to initiate a fallback protocol that would reposition observation assets beyond the city's outer limits. Emergency services on the ground began withdrawing from the immediate vicinity as power outages spread into neighboring districts, their radios filling with reports of unexplained pressure waves felt in buildings that had not yet shown visible damage. Back in the chamber, the remaining intact containment units began to fracture without direct impact, their seals failing under stress that no longer originated from physical force. Compound V pooled along the foam-covered floor, its surface tension breaking in slow, viscous threads that drifted toward Jin-Woo's position, as though influenced by a gradient invisible to conventional sensors. Maeve regained her footing within the trench, her gaze moving between the spreading rupture and the man who had initiated the interaction. Vaught's executive board authorized an emergency purge of the vault's remaining contents, yet the command arrived too late to prevent the cascade already in motion. Above them, the tower's evacuation advisory escalated into a full structural warning that went unanswered by personnel now focused on survival rather than protocol. News helicopters retreated beyond the blackout zone, their cameras capturing only darkness where Vaught's lower floors had once been illuminated. and the loss could no longer be contained. By the time the order to purge the remaining Compound V reserves reached the Vault's automated systems, the environmental threshold required to initiate the sequence no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Suppressant foam had thinned into an uneven slurry along the chamber floor, reacting to pressure gradients that shifted with each movement Jin-Woo made within the shadow density surrounding him. The Vault's containment frames, engineered to withstand directed kinetic assault, began to deform under stresses that registered as neither impact nor heat, but something closer to sustained atmospheric displacement. From Langley, the CIA's final predictive models collapsed into cascading uncertainty as real-time data from Manhattan ceased to align with previously established baselines. Analysts attempting to track the anomaly's spread noted that its epicenter no longer corresponded precisely with the Vault's physical location, suggesting that whatever interaction had begun there was propagating through structural pathways into the surrounding infrastructure. The agency had prepared for public fallout in the event of a breach. They had not prepared for the possibility that containment failure could extend beyond corporate boundaries without visible dispersal. Inside the chamber, Homelander advanced again, his posture reflecting a shift from dominance to intervention as he reached for Jin-Woo with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The contact he intended never fully resolved, intercepted by a partially manifested shadow that dispersed under the strain, yet redirected his momentum into a fractured containment unit. The resulting rupture released another wave of Compound V mist that mingled with the suspended gradient already filling the space. Maeve climbed from the trench as the Vault's lower reinforcement struts began to shear, her stance widening to maintain balance as the tremor intensified into a continuous vibration. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting elongated shadows that pooled unnaturally along the chamber's edges. Outside, the military perimeter extended beyond Midtown as observation assets withdrew to safer distances, their instruments still reporting distortion along vectors that could not be mapped to seismic activity. Emergency services established secondary evacuation zones, their communications filled with civilian reports of pressure fluctuations felt in subway tunnels and high-rise foundations alike. Back in the Vault, the remaining containment units failed in sequence, their seals fracturing under stress that no longer originated from any identifiable source. Compound V flowed outward in slow, deliberate currents, drawn toward Jin-Woo's position by a gradient invisible to conventional sensors. Above them, Vought Tower's structural integrity index reached a critical threshold that triggered an automated evacuation directive across multiple floors, though the blackout conditions rendered its visual alerts ineffective. News outlets monitoring the situation from beyond the perimeter began reporting unexplained darkness spreading across lower Manhattan. And the cascade continued. By the time the last intact containment unit in Vaught's primary vault failed, the chamber no longer resembled an engineered space so much as a pressure well centered on Jin-Woo's position, its boundaries defined less by reinforced walls than by the gradient that now drew suspended Compound V toward the shadows gathered at his feet. The Vault's environmental systems had shut down entirely, their final attempt at a purge sequence aborted when sensor feedback loops exceeded operational tolerance. What remained was not a leak or a breach, but an open interaction between a substance designed to rewrite biology and a force that did not recognize biology as its governing framework. From Langley, the CIA's live feed returned for a final time before dissolving into static, offering a fragmented view of Homelander and Maeve bracing themselves against a tremor that had progressed beyond vibration into sustained displacement. Analysts attempting to maintain visual lock noted that the epicenter of the anomaly had begun to shift vertically through the tower's lower levels, suggesting that whatever had initiated within the vault was now propagating upward along structural pathways. The agency had sought to prevent Vought from developing an uncontrollable asset. Instead, They had introduced a variable that rendered containment irrelevant. Inside the chamber, Homelander's final advance carried him into the densest concentration of shadow yet formed, his movement slowed by a resistance that did not correspond to mass. Maeve followed, her intent no longer to separate combatants, but to prevent whatever interaction had begun from reaching the upper floors where civilian personnel remained trapped by blackout conditions. Jin-Woo did not retreat, his attention fixed on the way the shadows coiled inward as the compound pooled along the floor in widening arcs. The first fracture in the vault's ceiling registered not as an impact but as a release, a line of stress that propagated across the reinforced concrete before splitting it into uneven segments. Dust fell in slow, deliberate streams that caught in the shadowed gradient and vanished before reaching the ground. Above them, emergency lighting failed entirely, plunging the chamber into a darkness that did not originate from power loss alone. Outside, the aerial perimeter withdrew beyond the river as military command initiated a full evacuation advisory for surrounding districts, their communications strained by reports of pressure fluctuations extending into neighboring boroughs. News helicopters captured a widening blackout zone centered on Vought Tower, its upper floors still illuminated by emergency generators that flickered under increasing load. Back in the vault, the gradient intensified into a visible distortion that bent light toward Jin-Woo's position, the suspended compound V responding as though drawn by an unseen current. Homelander halted within arm's reach, his expression reflecting the moment he understood that eradication would not reverse the cascade already in motion. Above them, the tower's central support column failed. The resulting collapse did not occur as a sudden drop, but as a controlled descent that propagated upward, floor by floor, as reinforcement struts yielded to sustained displacement. The blackout zone expanded with each passing second, swallowing the surrounding streets in a darkness that emergency services could not penetrate. Jin-Woo stepped into the deepest shadow available as the vault's ceiling gave way, his form dissolving into a space that no longer aligned with conventional geometry. Homelander and Maeve remained where they stood, braced against a force that did not strike but continued to press inward. When the tower's lower levels finally settled into the foundation below, the gradient did not dissipate but stabilized, extending beyond the site into the bedrock beneath Manhattan. Power returned in flickering intervals across the city, revealing a skyline altered not by fire or debris, but by absence where structure had once been. In the days that followed, international observers would note that the blackout zone did not recede entirely, its edges defined by pressure readings that remained above baseline without visible cause. Vaught's public statements attributed the collapse to an unprecedented infrastructure failure compounded by internal sabotage, while federal agencies denied any involvement in the incident. No mention was made of the shadows that now pooled unnaturally along the streets nearest the site, or of the man who had been asked to investigate.